So what I'm going to be lecturing on today is JavaScript. So this is a full stack course, and so it wouldn't be full stack if we didn't talk about the sort of the front end, client side of things and bringing JavaScript into the mix. These days on the web, JavaScript's getting more and more the language. So often JavaScript is by way of something like Node.js, your backend language and your front-end language. With Rails, they take a hybrid approach, and of course you have Ruby in the backend, and you can serve out a mixture of JavaScript mixed with Ruby. So you get just like you get the ability to echo Ruby into HTML with your ERB files, you have JavaScript files that can be half ERB and half JavaScript as well. And you can serve those out as views instead of actual HTML views. And then what the JavaScript views can do is they can dynamically change the page. So I've got an existing app here that I developed in another class where I had these customers, and I can add them to a to-call list. And when the to-call list was empty, it said there are no customers to call. And I could click on one of those customers. I made a slight change since the last time I was working on this, is I made sort of a smaller version of the partial. So there's one customer to call in the call list. Click on the next one. There's two customers. Click on the next one. There's three. I can remove individual customers by clicking this mark as called, and I can clear the whole list. All of that's done through full page reloads. So the entire body content is refreshed every time I add or remove from that list, and I'm going to make some modifications today so that it's going to be JavaScript that makes those changes. So you will click on this button. An AJAX request will be made to the back end of the server to add this particular user to the session hash that's being used to store the customers to call, and then JavaScript will kick in and it will dynamically add that customer to this portion of the page, similar to what you could do with a, say, like a dynamic shopping cart that you have on the page. And if I get through that quickly enough, I'd also like to dynamically add some little success or error messages to sort of pop up at the top of the screen to say, like, yeah, the user's been added, or you can't add that user. Maybe the user's already in the list, and I'll make those sort of dismissible error messages that can pop up over everything else on the screen. So just to review what the backend code looks like, I've got as far as my routes go, I've got an index route for my customers, and that's where most of this work is being done. That's this main page right here. And then for the add to call and mark as called functionality, I've got member routes that are responding to post requests, so I can post an ID to either one of those, and that will trigger adding or removing a customer from the list. And then I have a collection route that I can post to that just clears the whole list out completely. And then from the controller side of things, I have this index that is just loading up all the customers. And then the add to call and mark as called functionality is happening here. In both cases, we're getting the ID from the params hash and either adding it to the session if it's not already there, or deleting it from the session array of the customers to call. And in both cases, we're redirecting back to that customer index path. When we clear out the call list, we just set the call list to an empty array and redirect back to the customer path. And then I have some before action callbacks that do things like load up the customers to call before the index action. So that sort of puts into the customers to call instance variable, I sort of use my session, the array of customers that are in that session, to find all those actual customer objects, and that gets sent off to my view, and that's what gets displayed by way of the layout, if we were to look in the layout here, that's what gets displayed to display the list. So I'd probably break this out to a partial if I was making an actual application instead of having it in my layout itself. But right now, if there aren't any customers to call, if that list is empty, I just say as much. And otherwise, inside of a card deck, I render out this partial with the customers to call. And I also display that clear call list link. And the other thing I should note is that I'm using Slim for this project. That's why this isn't actual HTML markup, it's Slim markup, so it looks a little bit cleaner than if it was HTML. So what I would like to do is I would like to take this remember to call link, also take this mark as called link and this clear call list link and turn them all into AJAX requests that will then render JavaScript instead of HTML as their response. So normally when you hit a controller action, the normal response is, unless you get a redirect, is to look for a view of the same name and try to render it. I'm going to go to my partial, and to make the remember to call, to make that an AJAX request, I just add remote true as a parameter on my link to. So the link to is building my link, and I just say, oh, I just want it to be remote true. The link will still be submitted as a post. But now, when the add to call list runs, I no longer want to redirect the customer. What I want is at the end of this action, Rails is going to automatically load the view, and in this case the view is going to be not a HTML view, but I've got it in here already. It's going to be named after the action add to call list, but in our case it's now js.erb. So now our views are a mix of html.slim views and js.erb views. And just to test to see if this works, I'm going to put an alert in here and just say woot. And so what should happen is I should be able to restart my server. I should be able to click on this remember to call link that I have set as remote true. That will then execute the customer controller's add to call list action. It will add that customer to the session array, and then it will run the associated JavaScript, which should just say woot. So if everything works, we'll see that message. The thing with working with JavaScript is that we've now just sort of upped the complexity of our project. There's so many new places for things to go wrong, right? So before, things could go wrong primarily on the server side. Now things can still go wrong on the server side, but they can also go wrong on the client side, and JavaScript tends to fail silently. And so to debug this, we will look in a few places. We will look down here in sort of the server window to see if a server-side error occurred, but we might also have to do like a Control-Shift-I, and in the console or the network tab, look for errors that are happening on the client side. So clicking on, or maybe making sure I can reload this page, clicking on Daisy Glutton here, remember to call, and I see the message woot. So that means it's working. That means the sort of the flow of getting this JavaScript to execute is working. That's good. That means, let's see, I'm going to close a few other of my files here because I don't need them. Okay, so that's good. That actually means it's working. that means I need to go ahead and actually add that customer to the list above here. So right now, this list of customers to call is being generated by server-side code. We're rendering a partial for a collection. I effectively just want the JavaScript to do the same thing. I want it to render the same partial for the new collection that I just added to and dynamically insert that into the page. What that means, though, is that the thing into which I want to render, which right now is this card deck. So remember with Slim, this is going to generate a div with a class of card deck. I need that to exist even if initially there are no customers to call, because I need a place for JavaScript to echo into. So even when there are no customers to call, I need a card deck. And I'm going to make it easy to find. I'm going to give it a to call ID. So again, this is Slim. This is going to generate a div with an ID of toCall and a class of card deck. So what I can do over here in the JavaScript side of things is I can create a variable called toCall, and I can do some DOM manipulation stuff. I can say document dot query selector toCall. In older versions of Rails, I would probably drop into JavaScript here, and I mean specifically jQuery, right? And jQuery used to just come bundled with Rails, but that's not the case anymore. With the last few versions of Rails, they've dropped the dependency on jQuery, just removing it, and so I'm just doing this in vanilla JavaScript. And so, you know, if this was jQuery, I probably would have done like a $sign toCall to find that particular element. But these days, you know, query selector and query selector all does all the things that the jQuery $sign operator used to do for us, so I don't find I really need jQuery anymore. Okay, so I found that, and all I need to do now is to target that div and replace its contents, so like inner HTML, with, and this is the weirdo part, this is where I have to do some ERB. So I'm now mixing Ruby with JavaScript. The Ruby will be executed on the server side before this code is actually sent out to the client side, just like our views work. So it's not like the client is actually, you know, the browser's not executing Ruby. It's being executed first, and I'm echoing into it. And so what I'm saying here is I want to render the partial, which is the tiny customer partial that I've got available, and I want to render it with that collection, which is the customers to call collection. This has to go inside of quotes because it's a string in JavaScript land that I'm just putting into this inner HTML. And then the only other thing I need to do that's slightly special here is Rails might potentially guard against this kind of injecting HTML into the page. It might think this is like an actual like attack of some sort because it has provisions for blocking things like cross-site scripting. And so I have to put the letter J in front of that, and that will just make it so that it'll be like safe for injection into the page. And then the other thing I need to do is I need to make this customers to call variable exist. In the old way we did things, we would always reload back this index, which would then call this load customers to call, which would actually then call this thing here. That was all happening by way of a before action, something that runs before the action. I now need that to call list to be reloaded after the action. And initially I thought I could just have an after action hook, but that doesn't work because the after action hook is actually called after Rails renders the view. And so, oops, what I have to do instead is just load customers to call. So I just have to call that method that I've got defined down below here, and it will make that instance variable accessible to this partial, which should inject it into the page. Again, I just need to restart my server here, and I should be able to test this out. I should be able to go to my page, click on a customer, and see them appear in the to-call list. So I'll clear the list so that it'll start empty. It starts as there are no two customers to call. Because I'm working with a really small resolution on this overhead projector, it's a little awkward. I'll like scroll down and then I sometimes won't be able to even see it being added in real time. So I'm gonna just sort of zoom out a little bit. Yeah, like that. And then I'll click customer remember to call here. And there it is. It appears on the page. Remember to call. Appears on the page. Remember to call. Appears on the page. And notice the page is not reloading. I'm not ending up back at the page. It's just dynamically changing just this one part of the page. So if I was to like, you know, view this, I'm literally targeting this div right here. This is the div, which is the to-call ID, and that is what's being dynamically updated by Rails by way of the JavaScript. And now I want to do the same thing for mark as called. I also have to remove this little message that there are no customers to call. What I would like it to say is when there are customers in that list, I want it to say that clear call list. I had to reload the page in order to see this clear call list, and I don't want that to be the case. So over here at the, what am I gonna do? I'm gonna add a few more div IDs or even just paragraph IDs. There are no customers to call. I'm gonna make it say empty list. And I'm gonna also have it be present over here. So it's going to be present both when the customers to call list is empty and when it's not, but I'm going to hide it when it shouldn't be seen. And the reason I want to do that is I want to use JavaScript to sort of hide or unhide it. So I'm going to use dhide. What is the, I have it written down here somewhere. I'm going to just go to Bootstrap. Bootstrap has a number, it's d-none of classes that I can use to hide things versus not. And then I'm going to do the same thing with this clear call list. I'm going to give it an ID, clear list, and I'm going to make it also appear up here, but it'll be hidden in this instance. So now, in all cases, all three of those things are always present on the screen when I come there the first time, but I can toggle whether or not they have this d-none on them to display them or not display them. And so I should be able to do that by finding them. So I can have my, what did I call it? Empty list. Find that in the same way, empty list and clear list. Gotta find that in the same way. Typoed this. Clear list. In all cases, I always want to do this rendering. But, and again, I'm going to resort to doing some ERB here. I can say if the customers to call is empty, do one thing, and if it's not, do another. And what I want to do specifically is if there are no customers to call, then I want to display this message. There are no customers to call. That means the paragraph, which is the empty list paragraph, should not have the D none on it anymore. So I should say empty list dot class list. So that's how you access the list of classes in JavaScript. Then I can just ask JavaScript to remove D none. And conversely, I want to hide the clear list. You can do the same thing, but the opposite. Go to the class list and add a D none. Again, this is all stuff that I used to use jQuery for because older versions of JavaScript did not have a nice way to access this class list. This was just recently added, and by recently I mean just the last few years. So not really all that recently, but yeah, we used to always resort to jQuery to do things like adding, removing classes, and again, we don't need to do that anymore. And when there are customers, I want to do the opposite thing. So I'm going to take these two things and put them down here, but do the opposite. Add and remove. And so now, when I reload my page, clear out the list. So initially it says there are no customers. When I click remember to call, the there are no customers should disappear, the customer should appear, and the clear list link should appear as well. Again, I'll make this a little bit smaller. Remember to call. There's the customer, the clear list appeared, and the other one disappeared. And now I just have to AJAXify these two links to make the whole system work as I want it to. So for that, I'm going to go into the other partial that I have, the one that's used for the two call lists, and I'm going to turn its mark as called link to remote true. And I can also go into the customer controller, and in there, instead of redirecting the customer, I have to load the customer to call list. And then I'm even going to repurpose the JavaScript view I have. So instead of making another view called mark as called and having it contain all the same thing, I'm just going to render the add to call lists view, and that will just, so we'll run the add to call list js.erb. And I can do the same thing for this clear call list. For the clear call list, oh, it already has a remote true. Good. Probably accidentally forgot to remove that while I was testing it earlier. And so for it, the clear call list, it just needs these same two lines. I removed the redirect because that was needed when we were working with actual views. And then I can paste those in. And everything should now be JavaScript enabled for those three different actions. Restarting the server, mark as called, I get an error. Let's see if that just means I needed to reload the page fully once. Mark is called, yeah. Okay, so remembering to call is still working. Should be able to mark as called and have them just disappear. And I should be able to clear the call list, and there are no customers to call. The last thing I want to do is just some little messages. So right now when I add to call, yeah, we see the customer appears there. But if we were using my full resolution, we might not always see that, right? We might be here, we'd say, who's in that list? Remember to call. It worked. It just, I would have to scroll up to notice that it worked. And so it'd be nice to pop up a little message here that sort of said, yay, what you just did worked. Give some interaction back to the customer. For that, I prepared a few partials ahead of time. I just went to the Bootstrap page, because I've already got Bootstrap on this project. And in the Bootstrap components, I went to the alert section and I grabbed the code for dismissible alerts. So here is what an alert message looks like in Bootstrap. They can have all different colors. They can be like dangers or successes or warnings, and you can make them dismissible by clicking and then they go away. So I grabbed this code, I ran it through a converter that made it into slim code for me and made a partial out of it. So I now have a success and an error partial that conform to what Bootstrap is expecting. And they both take or echo out a instance variable either called error alert or success alert. And so what I can do with that knowledge is in my customer controller, for example, when I add a customer, I can set a success alert message. You successfully added the customer to your call list. And then inside of my JavaScript code, where are you? There it is. I can have a little bit of code in here that if there is, again, using ERB, if there is a success alert variable, do a thing. And the thing that I want to do is display that partial, and I made a place for it already in my application layout. This right here is going to generate a div with an ID of alerts for me. And so I can go find that. I can say var alerts and use my document query selector to find alerts. And then in here, I can say alerts.inner HTML equals, and I can echo into that JRender, and I put that partial into a shared folder. I only need single quotes on that. And so if there is a alert message, render it to the page using JavaScript, it should pop up on the screen. I don't know if I have to reload the server for this or not, but let's take a look. So I've got two customers in my page. Should be able to add Daisy Glutton to the mix here. So I click this, and oh, there it is. You successfully added your customer to your list. It's dismissible, I can clear it out, and Daisy is in fact there. I can go add Wally, remember to call, and there it is. It's not super elegant, maybe it should fade in, but like it's the beginning of it. I applied a little bit of styling before class to make it look a little bit nicer than what it was looking like. So if we looked in my CSS, I have so that message pops up sort of over top of what I'm working on, not at the very top of the page so that I would have to scroll up to see it. I styled it with a fixed position up at the top of the screen and with a really big Z index, so it would be in top of everything, and it pops up like that, and I can dismiss it if I'm done with it. And I could do the same thing if, for example, when I remove a customer from the list, I could also make a little message happen there. So Mark is called, that's here. Good work. You called a customer. And then I could also potentially have a error message happen on add to call, such that if I try to add the same customer twice, I'm told that the customer's already in the list. So Mark is called. Good work, you called a customer. It's dismissible. Good work, you called a customer. And so yeah, I could also do an error, because I have a partial that works almost identical, and so I could do something almost identical to display it. I could do a error alert and render my error alert partial. And now up here, error alert, this customer is already in your to-call list. Rubocop is not liking the fact that I'm using an else with an unless, because that's a little bit awkward, and so it probably would prefer if I used an if and then shuffled this stuff around. Do you like that better, Rubocop? You do. Okay. Restarting the server. Over to here. Mark is called, should still work. Add is called, add to call list should still work. And it does. But if I try to add Daisy Glutton twice, this customer is already in your to-call list. So I get a nice little message that I can clear out when I try to do something that's not permitted. And there we go. So that is a little bit of a view of how you might integrate JavaScript into your project by way of these js.erb files. And then again, notice that in some places, you've got Ruby code, some places you've got JavaScript code, in some places you've got Ruby echoes, but at the end of the day, what's being delivered to the end user is all just straight up JavaScript. And you can actually watch this happen. So if we went into the network tab and we clicked, remember to call here, we would see in the network tab, because I've got it filtered for AJAX requests only, which are called XHR. Here's that call. It worked. It got a status 200. I can actually go to it and see the JavaScript that was delivered. There it is. There's when I'm doing all my query selectors, and all of the ERB is removed because it was processed on the server side, and the only thing that gets delivered to the browser is the actual JavaScript. So that gets handed over to the browser to be executed. So when debugging it, you might, go and actually check to see if the JavaScript being delivered, if it's not working properly, well, maybe there's an error in the JavaScript being delivered. And you would see in your console some kind of syntax error message, and then you could go to the network tab and you could see the response tab and debug why that is problematic. And you can see all these slashes to escape things like double quotes. That's specifically there because we did that J for the render. Otherwise, we would end up opening and closing the string that we're currently within. Yeah, I think that's it. The only other thing I'll say is that I've started writing JavaScript without semicolons. Feels a little bit dangerous because I was trained to never leave off semicolons in JavaScript. But all the cool kids are doing it these days, so I guess I can too. So that's something I've just noticed in the JavaScript community is that it used to be dangerous to rely on the browser to do its sort of JavaScript. It did this kind of thing where it would insert semicolons for you if they weren't there, and it was not always super consistent, but the browsers these days are really good at it, so why would we bother with semicolons when we don't need to use them? And it makes JavaScript a little bit more Ruby-ish, a little less noisy. Okay, that's gonna close this video down.